perhaps one of the most, if not the most important topic that we have to be talking about today that isn't getting nearly enough attention is the issue of climate change. It's easy to not make it a central focus now because Trump is not in the White House. And I've always said that the worst part about Trump's presidency is how he handled the environment. But that doesn't mean that Biden is doing a much better job. And considering the fact that he is now not pulling our troops completely out of Yemen, he is not banning fracking, and he is not supporting the policies that need to be supported in order to push us towards a Green New Deal, my opinion, a clean energy jobs infrastructure bill is one of the best ways to make the Green New Deal happen. So now we are in what is known as a climate war. And that is the name of the new book where we're about to bring into the studio Michael E. Mann.
Okay, I have an introduction though here.
So
I mean,
Jen,
it's
let
not
Jen
like
do the
fancy
wonderful
or
introduction.
anything, but
no,
okay.
It's a good one.
Okay, well, it just, so Michael Mann is the director of the Earth System Science Center at Penn State University. He has authored more than 180 publications and 5 books. And I mentioned everybody before that this was the gentleman with the hockey stick graph, which I still, for the life of me, do not see the hockey stick in the graph. Well, but I'm not a hockey fan, so I digress. And so we are going to talk about basically climate crisis. This is an expert on this, and we'll talk a little bit about his new book. So let's say hi. We're tech. We're not the most techie people here. We're working on it.
We got him.
We got it.
Hey, bye.
Hey, guys. Hey, great to be with you.
Hi. Thank you so much for coming.
There it is. There's the hockey stick right above his right
Yeah,
shoulder.
but I don't see the hockey stick.
I actually have a real hockey stick if you want to see it. But I'd have
how
to
does
get
that?
up.
You'll have to explain to me why it's seen as a hockey stick. Like it's like one of those prisms or those 3Ds where I'm just not seeing it.
Well, it's just simply the fact that if you look at the last 1,000 years and what we did with the hockey stick graph, which is now more than 2 decades old, believe it or not, was to use various lines of evidence like tree rings and corals and ice cores to extend the temperature record of the Earth back in time, since we only have about 1.5 centuries of widespread thermometer measurements, historical measurements. So we wanted to extend that record farther back. And if you look at what it reveals, you see sort of this pretty mild, long-term, gentle cooling trend from 1,000 years ago into the depths of the Little Ice Age. That's the handle, and then the abrupt warming of the past 1.5 centuries, if you like. That's the blade. So it just sort of looks like it's like an L, a tilted.
Okay, that I can see. I mean, you can definitely see where we come into the picture and have to ruin everything.
Well, there you are.
So one of the things, and I'll admit I haven't read this, but one of the things that I saw in reading about this was this idea that the evildoers are basically changing the narrative around to put the onus on individuals. And that's one of the ways in which we're sort of running around chasing our tail instead of addressing what the real issue is. So I thought that, could you explain how that has operated, in terms of the messaging and what they're doing?
Sure thing. I want to make sure I got both your names. So Jen and
Peter,
right. Got it. So yeah, happy to do that. So sort of the old climate war, as it were, was this assault by fossil fuel interests and conservative interest groups, front groups, talking heads hired by them, conservative media outlets, what I call the inactivists, the forces of inaction. It was this effort to literally try to discredit the scientific case for concern about human-caused climate change. And I found myself at the center of that as a young physicist. Started out in math and physics, went off to graduate school to study physics, then got into climate modeling, the physics of climate modeling. And, I didn't envision that as a career path that would place me at the center of the most contentious issue we've ever faced societally. But because of that hockey stick graph that we ended up publishing back in 1998, I did find myself in the center of that old climate war. And I literally was attacked on the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal. I had congressmen and senators trying to subpoena my personal records, my emails. Basically, the full weight of this denial machine was focused on me. And as a result, I ultimately came to embrace the opportunity that gave me to try to inform this conversation. So what's happened is, as you guys know, the impacts of climate change, look, arguably we're watching them play out right now. We can have a more nuanced conversation about precisely what's happening in Texas. Some evidence that we might expect these sort of pieces of the polar vortex to sort of break off and drift south like they have this winter here in the US and in Europe as well. There's some evidence that suggests that climate change may actually make those sorts of events more frequent. And so we can't, we see the impacts of climate change play out in real time now in the form of devastating extreme weather events. And so those same forces of inaction, they can't deny that climate change is happening anymore, but they still want to keep us addicted to fossil fuels, right? So they've turned to this new array of tactics. No longer so much denial, but deflection, division, and even despair and doom mongering. Hey, if they can convince us it's too late to do anything about the problem, that potentially leads us down the same path of inaction. And so we can certainly unpack that, but that's basically the new climate war. These insidious new tactics that they're using, because look, they don't care about the path we take. They just care about the destination. They want us disengaged. And if they can't do that through denial anymore, they're going to turn to these other insidious efforts to disengage us.
I think it was perfect timing for you to come on the show. I think Governor Abbott and Senator Cruz's comments on national media it's direct corporate talking points from the fossil fuel industry. It's so transparently obvious at this point. Do you think that a lot of people are starting to get hip to what's going on?
Yeah, and we could probably, maybe it would be nice to hear from Ted Cruz, but I hear he's vacationing off in Vancouver.
He's in Cancun.
I heard. I don't know if it's been confirmed yet, but he apparently jumped on a plane back to Houston pretty fast.
You can't make this stuff up, can you, folks?
You know what? Honestly, is he absent-minded?
We've got to let Ted Cruz go.
Yeah, is he absent-minded on purpose or by accident?
No,
I can't decide.
He's a douche. You have to let it go.
Well, let me put it this way. Ted Cruz was a national debate champion when he was an undergraduate at Princeton.
Yep.
So, look, to be saying the things that he says, you either have to be dumb or you have to be amoral and malicious. Well, he's not dumb.
No.
Nope.
So there you go. So the so it's sort of right out of the new climate war. What you're seeing right now, Republicans in Texas are now trying to blame renewable energy. It's the Green New Deal and AOC that are responsible for this, when in fact the failure was in their fossil fuel infrastructure. It was natural gas, and it's because of their policies, because of Texas Republicans' belief that they have to be isolated from the rest of the country. They resist any sort of regulation and interstate, in this case, interstate commerce. And so because of their policies, there's no natural gas coming into the state. But the failure wasn't actually in the renewable energy infrastructure. It overperformed. It met its commitments and its expectations. It was actually the failure of their natural gas supply. And so they want a classic new climate war tactic. They want to deflect attention from that. And so now they're attacking, it's the wind turbines because some of them froze. Anything to distract us from the real problem, which ironically, this event really drives home, both the impacts of climate change and the danger of our continued reliance on fossil fuel infrastructure.
Yeah.
I do think that when you see, obviously a new administration come in, as I was just mentioning before you came live, a lot of people were paying attention. Listen, I understand that people couldn't stand Trump's rhetoric, but what matters to me most is policy above everything else. And his policy on the environment was unforgivable. That's the best way I can describe it. I know that Biden obviously will do a couple of good things. Getting us back into the Paris Climate Accord obviously matters. Potentially the Iran nuclear deal, but right now that's not looking too good. I think that there's sort of like this, there's a necessary scenario here where there has to be immense public pressure put on Joe, because I do think that, I mean, look, you never know what's going to happen, but I think the likelihood that he'll respond in kind more so than anything, Trump was ever going to do is much more likely. I think that there are just way too many red flags right now, and I don't think anybody can rest on their laurels. And I hear people say, well, he's only been in office for a month. My attitude is the guy's got until May 1st. He's got 100 days to basically make an impact. That's how long, it's an unwritten rule, but that's basically how long you have a mandate for. If he does not take dramatic action on the environment, I'm very concerned about where we could be going. What are your thoughts on that and how we, ultimately can enact influence at that level? Because we do have elected representatives now, as you know, like AOC and others, who are willing to fight for the climate issue that we must do right now.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. You make some really good points there, and we do absolutely have to continue to put pressure, even on those who we think are on our side or on the right side of this issue, because if we don't continue to exert that pressure, they're going to give in to the opposing pressure from the fossil fuel industry and their lobby. And, there is a lot of pressure coming from them. And so we need to not only oppose that, but exceed the pressure that they are putting on our politicians to not act on the problem. I'm a little more optimistic, I have to say, when it comes to what Joe Biden has done thus far. You have to recognize, I think, a couple things here. As you alluded to, we really need climate legislation. No question about that. But the president alone obviously can't pass legislation. He can, write it and send it on to the House and the Senate, but it has to pass the House and the Senate. And we are quite fortunate, in my view, thanks to the efforts in Georgia, particularly the African American community and African American women who came out, and they gave us the Senate. They gave us, we would have had Majority Leader Mitch McConnell still, if not for their efforts. And Mitch McConnell would never bring a climate bill to the floor. So we couldn't have seen climate legislation in the scenario where Republicans had retained the Senate. But now we're in a very closely divided 50-50 with the tie-breaking vote by Kamala Harris. And that probably is, that's going to make it difficult, other than through reconciliation with 50 votes and the tie-breaking vote. You can pass certain things through reconciliation, and Democrats are talking about doing that to some extent on climate. But for the sort of comprehensive climate legislation we'd like to see, it's going to be difficult to get something like AOC and Ed Markey's Green New Deal through this Senate. But I do actually think that we can get some climate legislation accomplished over the next 2 years while we work, hopefully, to give Democrats a larger majority 2 years from now, so that we can see bolder legislation passed Congress. The challenge is to get something meaningful passed now to complement what Biden is doing through executive actions. And here's where I'm in particular, where I'm more optimistic, Peter, than you are on where we are and where we're headed. We did see the boldest actions ever by a president put forward by Joe Biden a few weeks ago in the form of these comprehensive executive actions that I would argue go about as far as a chief executive can go in implementing something like a Green New Deal without a legislative component, right? Because without legislation, it's very difficult to get subsidies for renewable energy, stimulus, and carbon pricing, and all these other things that we need. And so I think it went about as far as you could possibly go. And the most important thing of all was signaling to the world through his actions across the government, appointing climate savvy, policy people to every single, agency and department, every cabinet level position, incorporating climate now into all of the agencies, which is something we haven't done before. In the past, we've thought of climate policy as well as DOE and EPA. But what they're doing, and it's in part because of Obama administration folks who have talked to the incoming Biden team and said, look, if we had had the opportunity, here's what we would have liked to do. And so Biden is sort of doing what they said they would like to do. I think he's going pretty far. I think he's signaling to the world that we're serious, that we want to lead again. And you talked about the first 100 days, through May 1st. Well, on Earth Day, April 22nd, Biden is holding this international summit, which I think is really important because we don't want to wait until November for the COP26 conference, the next international climate meeting. If we arrive there and the various countries haven't done the hard work of preparing meaningful, commitments, because we've got to ratchet up those Paris commitments. They're not enough. We've got to go well beyond our initial Paris commitments. And in November in Glasgow, we have to have the nations of the world agree to do that. And by having this summit in April, it's sort of like a midterm to make sure that everybody's sort of doing the right thing, doing the work. So as you can see, I'm more optimistic about where we are and where we're headed. But let's not kid ourselves. We still have a monumental task ahead of us, and there is great urgency in acting immediately. So we have to continue to put that pressure, even on those we might think of as our friends, politicians we might think of as our friends, because they too are ultimately, they're vulnerable to political pressure.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I wanted, so you sound like you're satisfied with the Biden appointment picks.
Well, I want to see more, but yeah.
Okay, and then the other question I have for you, and this is sort of a science geek question, and this is where I hope it's not like one of those things for me that no matter how many times people explain it, I have to accept I'm never going to understand it, but I'm hoping that you can explain to me the thing with when you're paying for carbon emissions and how that works. And because that to me seems like something you were talking about as real attainable legislation and something we could have. And I just, you got to do it, like dumb it down for me.
Absolutely. So, so the bottom line is we've got to level the playing field, right? Because right now, fossil fuel energy is doing this damage to the planet. And, in the marketplace, that cost isn't represented. If there isn't some sort of price on carbon, then polluters pay no penalty for dumping their pollution into our atmosphere for free, as my good friend Bill McKibben has described it. I think that's how to think of it. And so we need to make sure that stops. And, Peter, you mentioned earlier on sort of banning fracking, and, that's part there. I like to think of it in terms of two things, two independent sort of paths that we have to take at the same time. There are what we call demand side measures. We want to reduce demand for fossil fuels, and you could do that through subsidies for renewable energy. You can do that through a price on carbon. So you level the playing field so that renewable energy gets to compete fairly. Renewable energy that isn't destroying the planet gets to at least compete fairly with fossil fuel energy. So that's sort of the demand side. The supply side is important too. Banning new pipelines, banning new fossil fuel infrastructure. And it's there in particular where you've seen a lot of activism, because those sorts of, pipeline protests, and they're visible, they garner media attention. So they're important opportunities for sort of commanding the attention of the public, but they also make a difference. They reduce supply. If we stop subsidizing pipelines, if we no longer allow drilling on public lands, which Biden is going to now block, and he's going to block the Keystone XL pipeline. So Biden is doing some of the right things there. When it comes to banning fracking, for example, this is something that we talk about a lot because I'm here in Pennsylvania, which is sort of fracking central, right? It's the Marcellus Shale. There is a vigorous sort of political debate about natural gas in this state. Ultimately, where I come down is that a fossil fuel, to those who say, well, natural gas can be the bridge to a fossil fuel-free future. No, it's a bridge to nowhere. The solution to a problem created by fossil fuels can't be more fossil fuels, right? I mean, it's just that simple. So how do we phase out natural gas? And what I would say is Biden does favor the sort of market mechanisms, carbon pricing, subsidies for renewables, things that make natural gas increasingly non-competitive, rather than an outright ban, which, it's you choose your weapons, and he, seeks to take a somewhat more conservative approach. But here's the example I would give. Look at what's happened to coal over the last 4 years. Coal has undergone a death spiral. Is that because of Donald Trump's war on coal? No, it's because the market is just moving in a direction where it's no longer competitive. We need to accelerate those processes, not just with coal, but with natural gas and petroleum oil. And so, yeah, we have to use every tool in the toolbox is sort of where I'm coming from.
Okay, so does that include nuclear?
What was it? Michael 𝘩𝘩𝘕𝘩𝘸, was that his name?
𝘩𝘩𝘸? Oh my God. One of my very first podcast guests came on and talked about nuclear and some people see it as a bridge.
Mike, I believe that's his name, Michael 𝘩𝘩𝘕𝘩𝘸. Does that ring a bell?
Unfortunately, it does.
Unfortunately.
Okay, this is why we have different
All right, so we got it. All right,
right.
right. You know, that's why it's all about it's a necessary conversation. Now, apparently there's a new form of nuclear energy that is supposedly being perfected that doesn't involve.
He probably knows.
waste.
He could probably write a dissertation on that.
Not quite, but I do know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes. So there is this belief that, you know, we can't actually move to a complete clean energy grid for at least who knows, 2 decades, whatever they're going to say, between solar, wind, geothermal, hydro, and biofuel. So the idea is that you got to have a bridge, and the bridge cannot be natural gas and coal. Could it be nuclear energy?
Yeah, so it's a fair question. And, you know, the problem is these conversations are fraught because they're difficult issues to begin with, right? Just in a neutral environment, there are a lot of considerations. There are pros and cons, you know, because obviously there's risk with nuclear energy. And so you're balancing risk. We're balancing the risk of the proliferation risks, nuclear proliferation risks, and environmental contamination risks of nuclear, with the climate risk of not transitioning off fossil fuels, right? So the question then comes down to, you know, so it's a difficult conversation in the first place. And then what makes it even more complicated is there are, you know, actors in this space who have an agenda and are not really coming to the conversation from a place of good faith. They've got an agenda, a hidden agenda in many cases. They are, in fact, advocates, say, for some of those interests, be it fossil fuel industry or the nuclear industry. And typically, it's paired with a unjustified pessimism about our ability to scale up the obvious solutions. And let me emphasize that, you know, I'll sort of contrast my book, The New Climate War, which just came out, which sort of where I provide a vision of the path forward, where we do scale up renewable energy and we can meet, you know, projected energy demand by scaling up existing technology. And I'll contrast that with Bill Gates' new book, where he is sort of he expresses undue pessimism about our ability to scale up renewable energy. He's even said before that we need a miracle. To solve this problem, we need a miracle. We don't need a miracle. Look up in the sky. We've got the sun, the wind at our backs, geothermal, all the things that you mentioned earlier, Peter. We have solutions, clean energy solutions that don't come with those risks. And it's simply a matter of providing the incentives so that we scale those technologies up. And too often we hear, no, there's no way, you know, that we can do that. But hey, we could shoot particles into the stratosphere to block out some of the sunlight to try to cool the Earth back down. Or we could massively scale up new generation, new nuclear energy that doesn't even exist yet. So there is this contrast between an undue pessimism about the ready solution that we have, renewable energy, and this techno-optimism when it comes to potentially dangerous technologies that in many cases don't even exist yet. And we can't explain that sort of paired, that, you know, that discrepancy between, you know, the pessimism and the optimism without understanding that in some cases there is an ideological frame that they're working out of.
And let's be clear, you don't have like your agenda is just, trying to do the right thing, like what that is, right? Like you're not promoting any specific method.
Other than the fact that I'm massively invested in carbon credits. No, I'm just kidding. These claims have been made. These claims have been made before that we climate scientists are going to get rid off of this because of all the carbon credits that that we're
talking about. You went into this is the money. You were in it.
Oh,
I could show you. I've got a whole collection of carbon credits right over here that I could. No, I mean,
bookshelf. You got a great.
Yeah.
Thanks. I'd like to think that most of us are we care about the work that we do. We got into this really for the science because we love doing science. Many of us really realized that the science that we were doing actually had some really important real world implications. And we feel some responsibility to try to inform, the world about this threat. And we recognize that there are others who are trying to contaminate our public discourse, both our atmosphere and our public discourse. And so I feel like we play an important role in pushing back against the misinformation and the disinformation.
Michael, that is a fantastic segue because, as you probably know, Jen ran for the United States Congress against 𝘠𝘩𝘦 𝘍𝘪𝘐𝘢. And one of the big issues, I
did not know that. That's okay.
That's why we even have any platform is we were coming off of that campaign and decided to use this platform. Basically, we're trying to transform politics into service.
Remind me, what district is that? That's
third. It's the one it's the suburban region that is directly between Fort Lauderdale and Miami.
Yeah,
and it's think of
Broward County.
Yeah,
know it well. My brother used to live in Fort Lauderdale, and my parents in Boca Raton, so I know the area.
I was at Rate for 7 years, so
we are coming off of that. That's where we are.
Got it.
So one of the things that you just brought up, which I think is a fantastic segue, is that there are organizations that are in the climate movement that, let's just say, they're not everything that they're cooped up to.
Sierra Club.
So we have a couple of them. I would say the two most in particular that I took exception with is definitely the Sierra Club and the League of Conservation Voters. And these are two organizations that not only didn't support Jen, but I also understand in politics, you generally don't get involved with certain races if you simply don't believe that a candidate is viable, even if you believe what they're fighting for, because the difference between one who is taking the fossil fuel money and isn't it should pretty much be the deciding factor. But these two organizations decided to back 𝘍𝘪𝘐𝘢, who has a horrifically bad record when it comes to the environment, so much so that she voted to fast track the TPP. And anybody who knows what that would do environmentally would be disastrous. So can you speak to knowing how to sort of navigate this field of which climate organizations are truly fighting for the cause? Because there are a couple of great ones down here in Florida. As you said, you have family who lives in this area.
Yeah.
Bull Sugar is a phenomenal organization that's up in sort of like the central region of the state, right around Port St. Lucie and Fort Pierce in that region. And then we also have the Florida Environmental Caucus, which—
And we have a Sunrise Movement.
And we have the Sunrise Movement. Now, the National Sunrise Movement did not endorse Jen, but the Miami chapter, which is one of the biggest in the country, did endorse her. So there are some really good groups that are out there, but there are also some pretenders. And I think it's important, and would love for you to speak on this. How do you tell the difference between ones that are absolutely for the cause and ones that are, let's just say, playing the political game, if you will?
Yeah, it's difficult. There's no question. And, Sierra Club is an interesting one in particular because historically they were perhaps the most conservative of the environmental organizations. And, it was about saving the Sierra. So they had a pretty narrow mission. It was, and I will give some credit to Michael Brune. Under his leadership, they've moved in the right direction. There's only so much that one, president can do with an environmental organization, because there's a legacy. There's a legacy of who are the members historically, where do they get the support from. So I would want to say that and I'll confess sort of conflict of interest here. I'm personal friends with Michael Brune, and I do think that he's done a good job in getting them more involved on issues like climate change. So there's been a lot of movement. Does that mean they're entirely where we might want them to be? No. And in my book, I actually take issue with an article in Sierra Magazine that I felt played into one of the frames that I've been arguing is unhelpful. This idea that the solution to the problem is almost exclusively individual behavioral change. It puts it on us rather than the polluters. And of course, there's only so much we can do as individuals. We have to work within the system that's there. And if that system has the wrong incentives, then we're sort of stuck. If we can't get renewable energy because our providers don't give us that option, we're sort of stuck. And so, in that case, the Sierra Club had written an article which sort of played into that that idea that it's really about individual behavior and not so much about policy change. And I took issue with that. And I mentioned in my book, I take them to task on that. On the other hand, I do, I do sort of thank Michael Brune for trying to move them in the right direction. So, it's sort of, I hate to quote, the last person you want to quote, is Donald Rumsfeld. But I find I find myself, he has some good quotes, and sort of you go to war with the army you have, not the one you might like to. In this case, we have some very powerful opponents, the fossil fuel industry. And we need all of the allies that we can get. So there does have to be some degree of compromise in forming this alliance. And it's always going to be a little uncomfortable. And we're going to have to work with organizations with which we don't agree 100% of them. But hopefully maybe we agree with them more than 50% of the time. And with the polluters and those promoting their agenda, we agree with them 0% of the time. So I see where you're coming from. I really do. And it just comes down to some of the difficult rules of realpolitik, I guess. And where I come down is we don't have time. We have to act now. We've got to bring carbon emissions down by a factor of 2 within the next 10 years. So what we need to do is to get the action we can now while working to change the system for the better. And, people ask me often, what I think about capitalism. Can a resource-driven capitalist system be consistent with environmental sustainability? And I'm not convinced it can be. So I do think we ultimately need to move away from that system. But I don't think we're going to be successful in doing that within a few years. And we need to tackle this problem within a few years. So that's sort of where I come down.
We're speaking with Michael Mann, who is the director of Earth System Science Center at Penn State, my dreaded rival. I went to Rutgers.
I was a reject. Well, not really reject, but I had applied to Penn State, and they sent me a letter saying, well, you don't qualify for our main campus. And they offered me to go to Erie campus. And I'm like, oh, hell with that. So
Erie isn't so bad. The sun comes out like once or twice a year. It's really nice.
No, I'm from South Florida. That wasn't happening. I mean, I went to Colorado.
Sorry, Erie. I didn't mean that. No. Yeah.
Mike, if you could, if you have your phone, if you can hit the retweet button, we sent you a message so that way we could get more people watching for the next half hour. I do have. We do have a question from Felix Rios. I'm going to get to that, Felix, so just bear with us because we'll do like a rapid questionnaire at the end. I would say, you said right now, and this is something that gets talked about constantly, which I think is very important, which is, yes, time is of the essence, but we have to recognize that we can't get everything in a vacuum. We can't get everything done immediately as much as we would like it to. With that said, if you can pick one specific environmental issue right now that—
I'm looking for the tweet, sorry.
Okay. Yep. It should be from Jen's account. So my question would be, if we had like that one signature issue right now that you think would have the most immediate impact and the most necessary impact, because as you brought up earlier, no, he can follow. He's not like totally late yet.
I'm looking for it. I can't find it. I feel so bad. 10 minutes ago or?
No, if you look in private messages.
Oh, got it. There it is.
It's the private messages. That's not totally uncommon, but then again, it's also like one of those, do I really want to be bothered? Like, because if you're a public figure, you're technically not supposed to block people. There's they will. Well,
I'm not sure if I can share this because it's a private message. No, I'm just kidding. Here,
I don't know how Twitter
retweeted. Okay, sorry. So if the one thing, the one question was the one thing that.
Well, let's put it this way. If I could pick one issue right now, the best thing that Biden has done domestically in terms of the environmental agenda was nixing the Keystone XL pipeline. But the one problem with that is that you have a lot of people who are now out of work. I think that the most important thing, the legacy that could be Biden's presidency, is will we finally get an infrastructure bill centered on clean energy jobs? I do think that is the future, and that is what can ultimately change things. And you got people from all over the political spectrum who advocates for this, whether it's Bernie, whether it's Andrew Yang, whether it's AOC. I think most people agree that we are at that point. In fact, Ayanna Pressley came out today in favor of a federal jobs guarantee. So I do think that the conversation is moving where it needs to. But if there is a signature issue, even if it's one, even if it's ban on fracking, what do you think would be the most readily available, singular issue we could fight for right now that would make a substantial difference, you think?
Thanks. And I have to say, it's always a tough question for me because I feel like we have to fire on all cylinders here. And so I don't want to leave anything out. But I do want to touch on, because you raised this issue about displaced workers, and I think that's really important. Now, some of that is industry propaganda, right? The fossil fuel industry wants you to think that this is job killing. Acting on the environment is job killing. And the Keystone XL pipeline, there may be 200 to 300 permanent jobs associated with the Keystone XL pipeline. They want you to think it's thousands and thousands of jobs, but it isn't. There's some temporary jobs in construction, but very few permanent jobs, because the fossil fuel industry is now highly automated. And that's the dirty secret they don't want you to know. They don't provide that many jobs. They do make huge profits, and they want to keep making those profits. And the coal industry, for example, they made huge profits on the backs of coal workers who I view as the victims. And here in Pennsylvania, you do have communities, coal communities, where, people were sort of stuck in, their, it's the only job in that area. And you sacrifice your health. People die of black lung. Hundreds of people have died in coal mine collapses, and the coal barons never seem to care. They continue to make profits. They continue to violate. And I think of Bob Murray, who passed away like a year ago. Murray Coal, that disaster some years ago, where dozens of coal miners were killed because he had failed to address any of the violations, and there are literally hundreds of violations, citations that he had. So let's be clear: the coal barons, those are the villains. The coal workers are the victims, and we have to make sure that there are jobs for them. We can't leave them behind. Look, we have to make this transition, right? I mean, we made the transition from whaling back in the 19th century. That used to be an industry. We got whale oil, that's how we lighted, our oil lamps. And, we stopped doing that because something much better came along, and that was fossil fuels. Well, look, something much better now has come along. The age of fossil fuels is ending because something better has come along. That's clean energy. That's renewable energy. So let's help. We don't mourn the loss of whaling jobs, right? We don't say, oh, those poor whalers who are out of work. We're happy that the people who used to be doing that are now doing something that doesn't involve, killing sentient, beings. And same thing here. We would like to make sure that there are opportunities for people displaced in these fossil fuel communities, in these coal communities. And that is one of the things that I like about the Biden executive actions. Look, we need legislation to really codify that. But the Biden executive actions do try to provide, substantial funding for this civilian climate corps, like the Peace Corps, but hire a bunch of people to help clean up the damage and degradation from fossil fuel extraction, provide jobs in those communities, and like to do things like turn brown fields into like new hubs of economic activity. So they're really, for too often, we've just paid lip service, right? Like, oh, well, we'll retrain them. Well, how are you going to retrain them if those jobs are halfway across the country? It's easy to say that. It's much more difficult to really do something that makes a difference. And I do think that the Biden administration is trying to do that. They've learned from some of the mistakes of the past, in particular, Hillary Clinton, when she didn't show enough apparent sensitivity to the plight of West Virginia coal miners and those workers. That's one of the things that might have lost her the election. So the Democratic Party has learned some hard-won lessons. And I hope that Biden will make good on those commitments. But as you said earlier, Peter, we have to keep the pressure on to make sure that they do.
Yeah,
I do. Yeah, and again, I have to have the pessimistic eye. Not that I'm not optimistic. I'm as optimistic as anybody. I really am.
Oh, yeah.
But the reason why the pessimism sinks in is because there is a universal issue that basically unites all of us, as far as I'm concerned, and that is corporate special interest money in politics. It is the singular issue that everybody should be behind. Now, of course, we have three major cottage industries in the United States: big agriculture, big oil, and big pharma. But they all they're all interconnected in one way, shape, or form. Now, if you can talk about and what you've seen on Capitol Hill over the past, well, just again, it's a very short period of time, because I try to explain to people only in the past few years did anybody, especially on the Democratic side, even think about primarying sitting incumbents. Can you talk about the difference that you have now seen on the Hill over the past few years in terms of the way the conversation is shifting and getting elected representatives who do not take corporate special interest money, and how that does make a difference?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, John Fetterman, who is in Pennsylvania.
That guy.
Yeah, he's great. And he's going to be running for that open Senate seat when 𝘠𝘩𝘦, the current Republican, steps down. And Fetterman just announced yesterday that,
Sorry.
we have a special guest. She's coming.
She's just needy.
Hi,
Sorry.
Lou.
Oh, no, you guys froze for a moment there. Sorry. It may have been at my end. But what's her name?
Lulu.
Lulu, what a cutie. So John Fetterman just announced with a tweet the other day that he would not accept any fossil fuel campaign money. And I do believe that all politicians should do that. They should refuse any fossil fuel funding. I don't think there's any question about that. A good friend of mine who you may be familiar with, Senator from Rhode Island, Sheldon Whitehouse, has really been leading the effort to get dirty money out of politics, to get dark money out of politics. And I do think that that is essential. I don't know how we solve some of these problems without getting special interest money out of politics. Now, I am a little encouraged by the fact that even with the flood of special interest money, we were able to get a Democrat elected. We were able to get back the Congress, the Senate, but just by the slimmest of margins. It shouldn't have been that close, right? It shouldn't have been a near split in the country between somebody like Donald Trump and somebody like Joe Biden. You talk about night and day. One would destroy the world if he could, if he benefited from it. The other, I believe, has a good heart. I really do. And that's a monumental difference. But, it was only 4.5% difference, near equal split. How can that happen? How could it be that somebody like Donald Trump got nearly half of the vote? Well, we can only understand that through the influence of dark money and dirty money in politics, and we've got to get rid of it. And I hope that Sheldon, has a larger majority working with him maybe 2 years from now, where we can actually get some real legislation through that starts to get the dark money out of politics. Ultimately, you know, the Democrats have to win multiple presidential elections to get a Supreme Court that will be willing to reject the Citizens United decision that put us where we are today. And so it all comes down, it really does, to voting, and not just voting in the presidential years, but the off-term and the midterm elections. It's so important, because if we don't turn out in those elections, well, we know what happens. We get back, you know, our polluted politicians.
Yeah, I think it's important to draw the connection between our military industrial complex and the level of pollution in the world. And this is one of the things that comes to my mind when I hear people trying to blame it on the individuals, because I'm thinking, if everyone I know recycled and drove their little hybrid cars and did the best they could, and our military was still our military, then it's not going to matter what we're all doing. And so that's something to me that's one of the biggest issues with climate, and people don't understand that connection.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that, look, we've been fighting foreign wars in dangerous places to keep the oil flowing. I mean, and so there is this inseparability between, you know, our involvement in places we shouldn't have to be and we shouldn't be, and all in the name of protecting the interests of the fossil fuel industry. And by the way, when we talk about subsidies, and of course the Murdoch media and the climate change denial lobby love to rail against any subsidies for renewable energy that attempt to level the playing field, but they have no complaint about the subsidies that the fossil fuel industry gets. And the largest subsidy of all is literally the billions of dollars that we have spent fighting foreign wars. That is a subsidy to the fossil fuel industry that is never taken into account, and the environmental degradation and damage that is never taken into account. And if we were to do a full cost accounting to account for all of that damage and loss of life, we would never be continuing to provide support for new fossil fuel infrastructure. So, you know, I guess the lesson is these things are inseparable, and we can't separate them, but the solutions are inseparable as well. If we get off fossil fuels, then we no longer have any reason to be fighting these dangerous foreign wars that are aimed at getting a hold of the remaining, you know, oil reserves on the planet.
And I do think that that's one of the biggest reasons why, you know, it seems to me that the issue of universal health care, particularly Medicare for all, has really captured the imagination of tens of millions of people in this country. But part of the reason why I think they fight so hard, even something as simple as health care being a human right, which it is in the overwhelming majority of the planet, is the fact that
it should be. Let's just say it. It should.
Of course. Yeah. And once one domino falls, I think they fear that the whole thing falls apart. That's what I think it comes down to. I think they know that the second the people, this is why, you know, again, even right now, we're not getting, you know, stimulus checks, which is in effect a universal basic income. The second the American people recognize that they have the power, it's all over. And now it's just a matter of whether or not people are going to be smart enough to coalesce. Because I think that there's a lot of opportunity, even on the GOP side, for them to really change the way they do business. There's a significant amount of the working class that supported Trump, even though Trump is what I call the false prophet. But the rhetoric was there for actually helping the people in need. And to me, that as much as anything is what I think we can accomplish going forward. Now, is there anybody on the GOP side who's smart enough to think, man, if I just say the rhetoric, but I say I'm taking no corporate special interest money whatsoever, I have no doubt that there will be sort of this catch fire type circumstance. And Jen, I think you can speak to a relationship that you have here in Broward with a person in the Republican Party who is all about the environment, is all about protecting.
Yeah, it's interesting. We need to stop labeling people and assuming what their stance is on different positions. We have an issue here where we often will have developers that want to do drilling or fracking in our Everglades, and where they want to do that.
What could possibly go wrong, right? Yeah.
What could go wrong? We're built on limestone. See, since you're a scientist, I could just say we're built on limestone. Our drinking water is like an X of these two canals that come down. And this oil company wanted to drill right in the middle of the X. What could go wrong? So I actually made a connection in the Republican community here, and they are very pro, in where we come from, Everglades restoration.
Right.
And so anybody who's for Everglades restoration is going to automatically be against the drilling and the fracking and all that stuff.
Right.
So those are, in that case, those are my allies.
Right.
And so I just think it's important that we cross those lines. And I think that that's why, for me, I do everything on a per issue basis. And who your ally is on one thing, maybe they're not on something else, but why not work with everyone on the issues that you can work with?
No, absolutely. And Carlos Curbelo down there has been an advocate. It's a lot of those Republican advocates for climate action are ex-politicians, are no longer in office, but they are pressuring their party to be on the right side of this issue. And I do think that there are some moderate Republicans who, look, they don't want history to look back at them as having been on the wrong side of the defining challenge of our time. I do think that that weighs on the minds of some of these folks, and that they are persuadable. A lot of them aren't. And you talked about false prophets. Donald Trump is a false prophet, but he stood for corporate profit, and that's all that mattered to the vested interests, who are very good at manipulating. I think of them as sort of the ground forces, the voters, right? They need to win elections, to remain in power, they need to turn out people. And one of the great tragedies of modern politics has been the ability of one party in particular, the Republican Party, to convince large numbers of people to vote against their own interest. And they've done that through clever propaganda campaigns. So it comes down to, again, the money in politics. You throw enough money in the form of advertising campaigns, et cetera, you can convince people to do just about anything, including voting completely against their own self-interest. And that's what Trumpism really is about. The very people who by and large supported him are the people most hurt by his policies. And so, I actually forget your original question, but I think we're pretty much all in the same,
Yeah, the importance of essentially not, again, we are a very divided country, but both sides benefit from that. That is what is most important, because corporate special interest money flows through the Democratic coffers as much as the GOP. The only difference is the Democratic side actually has a completely grassroots uprising that is happening within the party right now. Ayanna Pressley, AOC, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Marie Newman, Jamal Bowman, Ro Khanna, Cori Bush.
Yeah.
There are some really solid progressives that are in there. And
look, they've pulled, let's be clear, they pulled Biden quite a bit towards, the progressive direction, toward, the left on environmental issues, through the pressure that they brought to bear during the election and thereafter. And part of why Biden has been surprisingly bold on climate was because he was held accountable by progressives in the party. And so it works. It really does. It's so important to do. And even if, those progressives didn't get their ideal candidate, and a lot of those folks, supported Bernie Sanders, for example, Bernie Sanders and the movement behind him really moved us dramatically in the right direction on climate. And it's why we're seeing such a bold agenda. So I don't want to say we rest on our laurels, but we recognize that it does make a difference, that activism really does make a difference.
And as right now, I would say, if we're being complete, and again, I don't want to overinflate the numbers in any way, but I would say, if we're being completely honest about who are the true progressives that are in Congress right now, I'd say it's probably between a dozen to 15 people, if we're being absolutely fair. When the Tea Party took over Congress, they had about 40 representatives that were following that ideology. Right. Could you even imagine how much of an impact the progressive movement can have if they had 40 sitting congressional representatives? Listen, it could very well happen in the next few years. It could. because the momentum is building. People have to recognize that it is happening. And I think if we were able to get there, I mean, the sky's the limit, because you would really have you'd have an environmental caucus that was legitimate. You'd have a progressive caucus that was legitimate. And I do think that if you were to get 30 representatives, the type of impact that that movement would have on the Hill is significant. Everything would have to be approved based on what they felt was applicable to get through the House and the Senate potentially. Senate's a little bit more complicated, but the House, absolutely, no question.
No, I agree, and I think we do see that, right? I mean, we're going through a cultural tipping point moment now on issues of racial justice, and that intersects, of course, with climate justice, and all of that. That's becoming mainstream for the Democratic Party, a mainstream position that we have to act on issues of racial justice, social justice, and climate justice. That's become the mainstream of the Democratic Party, and that wasn't really true, a few years ago. And so, again, I think that there's clear evidence that pressure really does. It does move the center of the party in the right direction. It isn't just, the people who might be in the progressive wing of the party and their immediate influence. It's how they are impacting everybody else within the party, moving the whole party. And that's what the Republican Party has been so effective at doing, where we've reached a point now where Ronald Reagan would have been primaried. If he was a Republican senator, he would have been primaried as a left, I mean, a rhino, a left-leaning rhino. Today, Ronald Reagan wouldn't even find any place in today's Republican Party. They have been very effective.
Blend in with like Joe Biden. He'd blend in lovely with the current central Democrats.
Honestly, you look back on Reagan's legacy, and I still say that the thing that he did that hurt this country more than anything else is that he crushed labor. And when he fired the air traffic controllers in the summer of '81, it broke the labor movement, and it essentially forced the hand of the Democrats, who then ultimately started the third way, the DLC, as you know, and then it became
corporate money.
The corporate party. They decided that banks were more important than labor.
They
unions.
weren't getting money from labor unions because labor unions were completely neutered, and so they started taking corporate money. So it kind of all stems back to.
But that whole thing about the environmental movement right now, I think a lot of it is being done in conjunction with a sort of a resurgence in the labor movement. I do think that is what is coming. This just something as simple as pushing the envelope on the $15 minimum wage. Everything in many ways, as far as I can see, is interconnected. And you've been following this, I'm sure, for a long time. A lot of these things, it's almost like a perfect puzzle. You remove one piece, the whole thing falls apart, but you connect that other piece that needs to be there, and everything can come together. Like I said, that's why I think the establishment fights as hard as they do, because they know as soon as the people get a taste of what it's like to actually live in
a civilization,
it's over. It's over. It's just a matter of when it happens. And I think as long as we have individuals like you, and again, we're speaking with Michael Mann, his book is The New Climate War, and it is going to be one hell of a fight, because even though the Democrats are in charge, they take corporate money too, but we are moving the needle. Michael, any final thoughts? Definitely want to know about, what your plans are going forward.
Yeah,
Obviously,
thanks.
That I think that would be great for the audience, and I certainly hope we can continue this conversation going forward.
Absolutely.
We're trying to do what we can to really build a true progressive movement down here in South Florida. It's a long time coming.
Well, no, I really appreciate that, and it's incredibly important. We saw in the last election how this isn't the Florida. We didn't see the Florida that I know and love, and so we need to return that state to its rightful role in our national politics, because it's been captured in some ways through I don't know, dubious means, I would say, by the political right. But it's not the Florida that I know and love, like I said. Going forward, I do think that there's an incredible opportunity for us, that we really are at the cusp of seeing the action that we need on climate. And I am optimistic about, the early actions on the part of the Biden administration and the signal that's sending to the rest of the world, and is putting pressure on other intransigent actors like Australia, currently led by a conservative prime minister, Morrison, Scott Morrison, who is a friend to the fossil fuel industry there. I did a sabbatical there last year. I was there during the Black Summer when bushfires raged across the entire continent, and we all witnessed the devastating impacts of climate change. But they have this stranglehold on their media by the Murdoch empire. Much of their media is owned by Murdoch, and he promotes climate change denialism and all of these other tactics that I talk about in the new climate war: deflection, division, etc. So the bottom line is we're really close. We're so close to seeing the progress we've worked for so long. There are still these obstacles in our way. Let's recognize them. Let's learn how to fight back against these rear guard attacks that we're still experiencing from the fossil fuel and lobby and the inactivists, because we're so close. We just need to clear away those obstacles. But in order to do that, we've got to recognize them. And so the reason I wrote this book is that I felt that, there were these insidious new tactics that were being used to divide us, to deflect attention from the needed policy solutions, to promote doom and despair so that we feel helplessness and become disengaged. I wanted to help people understand those tactics that are being used against us, so we can recognize them, fight back against them, and win this war, for lack of a better word, this war for our planet, for a sustainable planet, for a planet that our children and grandchildren will inherit and hopefully still be able to thrive on. So that's still a possible future, but our window of opportunity to ensure that future is shrinking. So this is our moment. This is our time. Let's do it.
Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it
Yeah,
very
we've
much.
been
I'm going to
getting,
put the picture up again of the
Yeah,
book.
we've
Everybody
been getting
needs
a
to
lot
read
of, again, this is 2:00 in the afternoon, and I can only imagine
Yeah.
how crazy a schedule. I know you've been on all national media and all that, so I can imagine how many sleepless nights you've been having.
No worries.
I can tell you that the responses we've been getting in the chat have been exceptionally positive.
Yeah.
They are all saying what a great conversation it is. A number of people have already said they're going to buy the book. So clearly this has been worthwhile on both ends, and we certainly hope you'll keep in touch. And like
Absolutely.
I said, Jen is a true advocate for the environment. It's one of the signature issues that she ran on, and we're only going to grow this thing into something bigger with obviously with individuals like
we're
you
going to be
who
underwater
support.
here.
Oh yeah,
I mean,
we're
going to. I need scuba gear.
Either we're going to save ourselves or we're going under. So either way, I think it'd be better to save ourselves.
We're
That's
working on it.
That's my
You
thought.
guys are on the front lines. There's no question about it in both senses of the word. Let's keep the conversation going. Happy to come back and talk again.
Thank you so
We
much.
certainly will. Michael, thank you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and all the best selling the book.
Thank you. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.